what I'm here for. I'm excited to hear from Michael. So, welcome to Shaping the Future of Food. My name is Colin Kern. I am the development coordinator at IATP. I work to connect people with IATP in our work. So, I just want all of you attending to know if you've ever got questions or want to reach out and learn more about what IATP does, be interested in donating, if you just want to get connected more with our work, please feel free to reach out to me. When you get the follow-up email, there should be my contact information in there. I'm always happy to chat with folks about what we're doing. And if you're inspired to give, it is how we're able to do this work. And we can't be here without our donors. So thank you to those who've been able to donate. And if you'd ever like to talk about that in the future, I would love to chat with you about your interest in our work. So we are here today to hear from Michael about our farm conservation programs and a little update from him. Not a little, a big update on those programs and where they kind of stand this year. We're going to get things going in just a minute, but I've got a little bit of housekeeping to share. So if my team would keep us moving, thank you. We've got a couple of updates, or no updates, but things you guys know you've done. If you've been in a webinar with us before, we've got both the Q&A and the chat function. Folks are already signing in on the chat, letting us know where you're coming in from, what the weather's like there. If you've got questions today, which thank you to those of you who shared questions ahead of time. We had some wonderful submissions ahead of time, but we're also going to take some more of those during the webinar. We won't have time to get all of the questions, but we will do our best to answer as many as we can and kind of lump some together into common themes and ideas. But if you would use the Q&A function down at the bottom of the screen to share your questions, that helps us organize them and kind of keep it rolling. We also have closed captioning available, so please just click the CC button to enable that function. We'd love for everyone to be able to enjoy and follow along with what we're sharing today. So a little bit about IATP. Last year, we launched our Shaping the Future of Food series, where we provided an overview of IATP and the work we do. And we're continuing that series this year with a couple of different highlighted programs and featured reports and functions that our team have been working on. So for anyone who's new to IATP, we are the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. Very briefly, we are a research and advocacy organization that is focused on advancing the voices and policies needed to develop sustainable and fair food and farm systems. We recognize here that the current food and agriculture systems have been consolidated into big corporations with extractive practices, which we know are destructive to our environment, food system workers and farmers, and our communities. At IATP, we partner with other groups and organizations to hold big ag business accountable for their harms, and we identify and lift up the voices and needs of smaller producers. We champion agroecology and sustainable agriculture practices, as well as produce original research like you hear today on the related state to international policy issues and discussions and the impact they can have to damage or strengthen a sustainable future of food. I like to emphasize that this isn't the work of a single policy initiative or a single administration. This work really is that of a lifetime. So we appreciate you joining in with us today. We could, of course, talk a heck of a lot more about what we do in all the different spheres and the nuance, but in brief, I hope that gave you a sense of IATP and what we do. And like I said, be more than happy to chat with you some more if you would like. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce and hand over the reins to my colleague, Michael Happ. Michael is our program associate for climate and rural communities at IATP, and he's our in-house expert on U.S. agriculture policy. Michael's been researching and writing on these farm conservation programs for years. And you all, I'm excited. We're all going to get an inside scoop on a yet to be released report from Michael. So thanks for being here. You guys are getting an early view of where we're at with the farm conservation programs. And Michael, thank you for being here. Take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Colin, and welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. It's great to see so many folks on the call, names I recognize and names that I certainly don't, and it's very humbling. So for those of you who haven't met me, my name is Michael Happ, and I serve as the Program Associate for Climate and Rural Communities here at IATP. I've been working here for about 4 years, and I do a lot of work focused on U.S. federal farm policy. So conservation, crop insurance, the Farm Bill, all these things are kind of in my bucket here at IATP, which is a whole lot. And I'll give some personal background about me, why I care about this. So I grew up on a farm in northern Illinois, about halfway between Chicago metro area and the Mississippi River, the border with Iowa. My family raised corn, soybeans, pigs, cattle, and all the sorts of crops that are handy to have around for livestock. Things like alfalfa, wheat and straw, oats, various forage mixes for hay. I'm thankful that my brother and his family still live on the land and steward it. It's a beautiful part of Illinois, and it's where I first fell in love with the land and realized I wanted to do something to conserve it. Um, I also really strongly remember this creek that runs near the house I grew up. It was lined with trees and is a great spot to wade in the water during the heat of summer. Uh, just the sun going through the leaves and onto the water was just unbelievable and was the most beautiful place as a 10-year-old. Um, and I'm not sure how many of you remember how good of a year 2012 was for corn, but that was the year that our neighbor decided to rip out those trees along the creek, steepen the banks, and plant corn right up to the edge, maximizing the amount of corn he could get to market. There have been bust years for corn since then, but the trees have yet to grow back. So Claudia, if you would start up the slides for me, that would be wonderful. So while markets can drive environmental degradation, we have some programs that can pay farmers to do good work for the land. Today's presentation will focus on the Environmental Quality Incentives Program and the Conservation Stewardship Program. That's EQIP and CSP for short, which I'll probably be using for the rest of the presentation. Actually, Claudia, could you go to the next slide? So these are programs that, in a nutshell, if a farmer has a natural resource concern that they want to address on their farm, like any of the ones that you see on the screen right now, we're talking water quality, soil health, things like wind damage, runoff from a livestock feedlot, things like soil erosion and water erosion. Those are things that EQIP and CSP can help a farmer pay for to kind of alleviate some of that, right? If a farmer looks out at their field and sees that erosion going on, they're like, this is washing away a lot of the soil that I need. My margins are pretty tight this year. I might need some financial help to address this. That's where these NRCS programs come in. Programs run by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, their Natural Resource Conservation Service. They've been around for decades at this point, and they remain really quite popular programs. Next slide, please. So those resource concerns that you just saw, those can turn into resource benefits like you see on the screen here. We're talking, these programs can pay for things ranging from cover crops to fencing for a managed grazing operation. It can go to silvopasture, grazing livestock among trees as you plant those trees, things like hazelnut trees and pines and all these things that are native to your area. We're talking about windbreaks. We're talking about grassed waterways and buffers to keep some distance between your field and water. And we're also talking about things like high tunnels that can extend the growing season for small producers. These are all things that are eligible for funding through these USDA conservation programs. Next slide, please. So again, as Colin mentioned, we've been doing some research and reporting on EQIP and CSP for several years at this point. We've been trying to highlight the demand that far outstrips supply for these conservation cost share programs. For the past 5 years, roughly 1/4 to 1/3 of farmer applicants to EQIP and CSP were awarded contracts. Or if you flip it the other way, that means that 2/3 to 3/4 of those who apply do not get in. And that's where our title of our report series, Closed Out, comes from, right? There are a lot of farmers, thousands of farmers, who are being closed out of resources that could really help them improve conservation, improve their bottom line, things like that. So again, we've been hovering around this 1/4 to 1/3 of applicants getting into the programs for about 5 years. The 2/3 to 3/4 of farmers that are closed out of the programs, sometimes those folks go on to wait lists, but there are lots that don't, and that means that we're talking lots and lots of acres of conservation that don't happen because folks can't get in and thus can't afford conservation practices. To alleviate this issue, back in 2022, Congress passed and President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a huge bill, addresses all sorts of things related to climate change, but there was $20 billion dedicated to NRCS conservation programs to help address this very issue, to address the backlog of folks not getting into these programs. Next slide, please. And the short story is the IRA has been working to connect more farmers to these conservation practices. So again, the reason we're all here today is we are updating you with numbers from fiscal year 2024. That's going to be September 2023 to September 2024. That's the fiscal year according to USDA. And in that time frame, 43 to 44% of those who applied to EQIP were able to get into the program. And that's up 18 percentage points from the year before. A huge improvement. And when it comes to the Conservation Stewardship Program, that more whole farm program, that was up 23 percentage points from the year before. We're talking over half of applicants to CSP getting in. And again, it's not our position to say that everyone who applies to these programs should get in. There are deserving projects and there are those that maybe don't. But there are so many people who have been closed out who are very much deserving of help with these conservation programs, and a lot of good practices that have gone undone. So this is making some really good headway in addressing some of those concerns. Next slide. So here's a line graph showing the percentage of applicants who are awarded contracts over time. We're going back to 2010, kind of the modern renditions of these two programs. Historically, between 50 and 60% of CSP applicants would get into the program, and between 30 and 40 for EQIP. But again, these are federal programs. They're very much tied to federal policy. So I put little arrows here to kind of show some big markers in time there. So we've got things like the 2014 and the 2018 farm bills. Those two farm bills in many ways weakened CSP and EQIP, and you can see just the dive in applicants being awarded contracts there in 2014, and then a big drop-off, especially for CSP after the 2018 Farm Bill, where actually in 2018 the funding for CSP went down while EQIP went up, and that was, EQIP's funding increase was at the expense of CSP. And then you can see, so the IRA the Inflation Reduction Act was passed in 2022, but 2023 was the first year where the funding kind of turned on. And you can see we're really approaching some of the historic levels of applicants being awarded contracts here for both programs. So that was really, really good to see. Next slide. So I'm going to show you a map here. This is across the United States, color-coded, basically the percentage of EQIP applicants in each state who are awarded contracts. Now, those of you who are map nerds, who are graphics nerds, you might already be looking at that key, and you might see 100+%. You can't have anything above 100%. That's crazy. So that is how I chose to represent states that were meaningfully able to dip into their backlog, right? States like Rhode Island and Connecticut and Virginia and Idaho, New Hampshire and Arizona and Alaska. These states were all able to fulfill the demand of folks who are applying and able to go back into past years where there are farmers on wait lists and connecting them with contracts. So again, the IRA funding has been really transformative for a lot of states across the country in connecting and really addressing that backlog that we've been talking about. Next slide. So again, here are the top and bottom 5% states for percentage of EQIP applicants awarded. We've got states in the Northeast and the West that did really well in connecting their backlog folks to contracts. And again, I know it's painful to see something above 100%, but this is just the best way that I could think of to represent this. This is, meaningful change. And then we've also got the bottom 5 here. And believe it or not, for most of these bottom 5, these are improvements over previous years, with the exception of Puerto Rico. And you can see Minnesota, Missouri, North Carolina, Illinois, these are all really ag-heavy states with lots of people lining up out the door to sign up for EQIP. And again, I'm not going to pretend that EQIP is a perfect program. We've done some other reporting that shows that, depending on how you calculate it, roughly 30 to 40% of EQIP funds go toward what we consider industrial scale agriculture, things that people might refer to as factory farms, things that we don't consider to be real conservation practices. They might be things like great big manure lagoons or really structural practices that are quite expensive, when there might be lots of other conservation practices that are lower cost and higher impact, things such as conservation cover, things that help folks implement grazing systems. And we've got lots of other reports that we could point you to, such as costly versus cost-effective, which we released last year that gets into this very issue. Next slide, please. So here's another kind of interesting data point that sheds a little bit of light into the percentages that have been going up. So again, seems like a really good story that the percentage of applicants being awarded contracts has been going up. But if you look at the right side of this line graph, you'll see that actually the number of applicants between FY23 and FY24 went down. The number of contracts went up. This means more conservation on the land, but again, for whatever reason, people trailed off from applying. And we've got a couple of theories for this. The one that I'm kind of telling myself right now, and we do need to do more research into this, but there was just so much excitement around the Inflation Reduction Act and how much new funding was going to be available, that folks that might have been closed out in the past, or people who were first-time conservationists perhaps, they went and they applied for these programs for maybe the first time. So we got just a big spike in the number of applicants for FY23. So maybe as the years go on, NRCS needs to work harder to find applicants, right? To do things like reaching out to small and mid-scale producers, to folks who maybe haven't been served by these programs in the past. There's a lot more work to do there. And you can go to the next slide, please. So we're going to go through the same map and line chart situation for CSP. And if you'll notice, for CSP, there are a lot more states that are the darkest shaded color here. And again, that's folks who are able to meet the demand of all the applicants from last year and dig into their backlog in a meaningful way. So again, you see a lot of states in the West, some states in the Northeast, the Upper Midwest, that really did a good job in connecting IRA resources to farmers. Next slide, please. We've got the top and bottom 5 states. Nevada did an amazing job connecting folks on their backlog to contracts. But again, not that big of an ag state, right? These are just 35 folks who were able to get access to a CSP contract this past year. The territories of American Samoa and the Northern Mariana Islands did pretty well as well. Idaho and Alaska. There are farmers in Alaska, but you can see that's a pretty small number as well. If you look at the bottom 5, you'll see some familiar names. We've got Minnesota and North Carolina that were also on the EQIP bottom 5 list. Again, this is an improvement from past years. We're seeing almost 600 CSP folks in Minnesota being connected here. Mississippi, believe it or not, is a really CSP is very, very popular down there. There's been a lot of usage of the precision agriculture practices in CSP in the Mississippi River Delta, and you'll see some similar usage in states like Louisiana and Arkansas, kind of some of those Delta states. And then in Guam and the US Virgin Islands, zero contracts, zero applicants were connected to contracts this past year. Next slide, please. And then for CSP, kind of a similar story as EQIP. You see the spike for FY23 and then a drop-off for FY24. So we have some work to do to connect folks to make sure that people are still applying for these programs and we're not just doing the low-hanging fruit, right? The people who we know we're going to try and do conservation regardless. We need to do the next harder step of reaching out to people who might not be natural conservationists, but they have the land, they're farmers, they just need the help and maybe need that extra outreach. Next slide, please. So again, I love talking about the successes. There are a lot of great things to look at in this data, but I also want to just underscore that the conservation status quo is not enough, right? You see the line charts going up, you see the numbers, millions of acres, this is great. At the end of the day, the amount of conservation on U.S. farmland is still a really small percentage of the land. The Ag Census in 2022 showed that cover crops are planted on about 2% of U.S. farmland. A little over 2% of U.S. farmland is enrolled in EQIP, and a similar stat enrolled in CSP. There's another USDA conservation program known as the Conservation Reserve Program, and that sets aside land from production. And that could be, marginal land. It could be, land that is prime farmland, but it might be someone going into a retirement. Again, you're not, for the most part, farming CRP land, and we still face really, really important natural resource issues. Things like nitrate pollution crises in the upper Midwest, right, where water is being just overrun with nitrates. It's a drinking water hazard. We see a Gulf of Mexico dead zone, right? We've got all this runoff from the Mississippi River Basin out into the Gulf of Mexico, making it really hard for life to exist out there. We see similar, runoff issues in the Great Lakes, most notably with algal blooms that pop up every once in a while in western Lake Erie. And then we also see a steady rate of greenhouse gas emissions coming from agriculture, right? In a time where things like transportation and energy, they've been able to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. We've seen agriculture kind of remain stubborn. So we're not just talking about carbon dioxide, we're also talking about nitrous oxide, we're talking about methane, really, really potent greenhouse gases that come from things like animal agriculture, come from really complicated soil, things going on in the soil, and we need kind of an all hands on deck approach to addressing those greenhouse gases. Next slide, please. So again, in this report, we are really, we're showing the successes of the Inflation Reduction Act, right? This boost in funding that helped connect more farmers to conservation. But there are threats to it right now. There are so many farmers who have Inflation Reduction Act contracts right now, and those funds are frozen, right? There has been some reporting about, some money trickling out. You hear about the partnerships for climate smart commodities, getting a rename and a rebrand, and they're asking, the US Department of Agriculture is asking farmers to redirect away from a climate focus and more towards market focus, right? And there are a lot of folks who apply for conservation programs that don't actually know that the IRA is funding their practice, right? Someone might be going into their USDA office just for some help putting in some forage for their pastures, some fencing. They don't care where the money comes from. They might not even believe in climate change. But USDA has determined in the past that these practices are climate smart. And these folks are being punished. They're having their funds frozen just for reasons outside of their control. We also saw in the recent president's budget request a zeroing out of conservation technical assistance. And this is the pot of money that goes toward paying your local conservationists in your local county offices to go out and meet with farmers and see, okay, what conservation practices are really needed on this farm. Being that friendly face when you go in, twice a year or more to your local office, right? We were already facing an understaffing issue, and we're seeing thousands of NRCS employees being fired or resigning as a result of efforts by the administration. Um, so we're going to see the folks who are working there even more overworked. We're going to have less capacity for outreach, and we're going to just lose so much expertise that could help get good conservation on the land. We recently wrote an article diving into the 48 Natural Resource Conservation Service offices across the U.S. that were slated to have their leases terminated. You can go to IATP's website to check that out and see which offices those are. Some counties will no longer have that local office they can go to talk about their farm issues, right? They might have to drive dozens more miles, and depending on where in the country you are, maybe 100 miles to get to the closest one. And at what point do you, the farmer, realize that, I only have so many hours in the day. I don't want to drive those 100 miles, right? We need people in the community who understand local conservation issues, who have the resources and capacity to help farmers with their conservation needs. And then we also have the federal process, right? These are all programs that are usually funded through the Farm Bill. The last Farm Bill that was passed was in 2018, and Farm Bills are usually supposed to be 5-year programs. So we were supposed to see a 2023 Farm Bill, and it's now 2025, and we still don't have one. And there's talk right now in Congress of taking the money from the Inflation Reduction Act and putting that into the Farm Bill baseline, but through a thing called reconciliation. This is getting really wonky really fast. But I'll just say that it's IATP's position that we should not we should try to have a regular Farm Bill process, and we should make sure that the funding from the IRA goes well into the future, does not cut off in a few years, so we can make sure that farmers are still being paid going forward. And there are a lot of efforts right now to try and pit conservation funding against things like nutrition funding, which I think is, there are no winners there. So for those of you who are logging on to try and see, what are the kinds of things we can advocate for right now, we want to see stable funding going into the future. We want to see IRA funds protected and incorporated into the Farm Bill, but in a regular Farm Bill process and not through a side door that undercuts our nation's hungry. So again, happy to answer more questions about that. But next slide, please. So we've got some additional resources that you can go find. We've got some farmer stories from the National Sustainable Ag Coalition. These are folks who have used conservation programs to address climate and conservation issues on their farms. There's a really great resource that came out yesterday from the National Wildlife Federation, mapping some of the resources that have gone out by state, by congressional district. The Natural Resource Conservation Service, they have a page called the RCA Data Viewer, and that has really good information about how money is spent and goes out to the states. And then the Environmental Working Group has been doing great work for years compiling a conservation database. So anyway, go ahead and check out any or all of those resources. And then if you have any questions, if you want to use some of this data to, in your state, you want to do that line graph from 2010 to 2024, I can help you with that. And we're going to have a lot more really good information, really detailed information when the report comes out later this month. And I wish that this was some great marketing ploy by me to get you all to come here. I'm just a slow writer, and this webinar was set a few months ago. So trying to share as much information with you all as we can before the report is released. But yeah, happy to answer any questions. Colin, I know some of them have been coming in. I've seen some hands raised.
Yeah, Michael, I would love to get some questions to you. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. Michael, it was really fascinating, a lot to go into. I just want to briefly say, I don't think you give yourself enough credit. I don't think it's as much that you're a slow writer as this data is hard to find and parse through sometimes. Not sometimes. That's my understanding in talking to you. And so I actually, that's one of the first questions I wanted to ask. We had some of those submitted ahead of time, and some of these questions that we've gotten kind of are in that vein of like, oh, what date, what information do we even have about who has applied for EQIP before and what's been doled out? And so I was wondering if first you could just talk about how easily accessible is the data that you use to create these reports and to run these numbers?
Yeah, so it's kind of a mixed bag, right? So some of the resources I shared there, if you go to the RCA data viewer on USDA's website, they do a pretty good job of showing you money that's gone out the door, acres conserved, but you have a harder time finding this information on, well, how many people applied and got in. Um, so we usually have done a request to NRCS for this information, and you'll notice we had to give a range this year of folks who got in, right, for percentages. In the past, we've been able to give you a more precise answer, but within the last year, NRCS has changed its data dissemination policy, meaning that we can't be as precise. But we thought even with, kind of a wider range, we think it's still important that this information goes out there, that even if it's, a general idea of who's getting in and who's not, we think it's important for that information to get out there. So again, we submitted a Freedom of Information Act request along with the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition this year to get the data, and it just took a little bit longer. So again, we normally publish this in January, and it's May right now. So
Mhm.
it's just getting harder.
Yeah.
But it's public data, it's public dollars. We think it should be out there.
Mhm. In addition to it being challenging to collect the data, could you speak to the limitations of the data? So there's this question here about, what percentage of applicants are new to these programs? Who's been awarded programs in the past? Do we know what percentage gets approved as opposed to what percentage of applicants? Like, could you speak to that, or what amount is awarded to certain types of programs? And so if you could speak to some of the limits of the data that you're even able to collect, I think that'd be really insightful.
Yeah, so this is aggregate data. So we don't know really who is applying and who is. We can make some inferred guesses, and our next report that we'll try to get out this summer, it'll kind of look at the average cost of some practices, digging into EQIP, but we don't know, for example, if this is someone's first time applying for a program, right? Is this land that wasn't conserved before and now is? Are these, there are some things like CSP renewals that we can look at, and I know NSAC has published some of that information in the past that's been super helpful. But we don't know if this is a large operation, if this is a 5-acre farm, anything like that.
Hmm.
And I think some of that information is suppressed for farmer privacy reasons, which is understandable. So we kind of have to take a really big broad look at it, and there are definitely lots of limitations to the data we do have.
Hmm. Michael, we kind of mentioned some of your previous reporting about how not all equip practices are made equal, and some go towards things that you might not view as actual conservation practices. Could you speak to what kind of changes you would recommend to these conservation programs to make sure that more money is allocated to truly sustainable practices?
Yeah, so we focused on eQuip in the past as, this program that has funded a lot of really good things, but over time, more and more of it has been diverted away to kind of harmful models of agriculture in our opinion. Um, so when eQuip was first started, it was not, those funds were not allowed to go to concentrated animal feeding operations, right? These big confinements where potentially thousands of animals are in there producing a lot of waste. Eventually they changed that so that some of the funding could, and we've again shown that north of 30, close to 40% of EQIP funding goes toward industrial models of agriculture. Um, so we've been a little bit critical of funding going toward things like methane digesters, things like manure lagoons, things that are actually uh, really important parts of the business model of large-scale animal ag operations. And in the case of digesters and in the case of manure lagoons, might actually increase emissions, right? We're seeing where the livestock can account for up to 90% of emissions, and then you've got things like manure lagoons where you've got ammonia, you've got nitrous oxide coming up. That might be the other 10%. But a lot of these practices being installed incentivize herd growth. So at the end of the day, you might end up with more emissions, and we're using taxpayer dollars going down this rabbit hole without maybe solving the problem. So we've advocated for the passage of the EQIP Improvement Act, including that in the Farm Bill or passing it on its own, and that would deprioritize some EQIP practices, and it would also put a payment cap on EQIP, right? So that if your EQIP contract is above $150,000, you would no longer be eligible, and that's honestly, that's going toward most of those large-scale, what we consider to be harmful operations, and save some of the funding for some of the smaller-scale folks, the folks who need it, the folks who are really using more agroecological practices.
Hmm. Yeah, so like basically some of these things that might from an uninformed perspective or at a glance you'd be like, oh, a methane digester is a great thing, but it produces this incentive to be further entrenched in a system that can't be sustainable. Meanwhile, other practices are being closed out that would be far cheaper and actually supportive of a sustainable system.
Right, yeah, and there are some instances where maybe a methane digester, if the herd size is not increased, right, and you're using it for on-farm energy, like maybe that's a good solution. But there are also efforts to link it into this broader, biogas infrastructure. That again, IATP has done some other writing on that
Mhm.
to kind of talk about the scope of that issue and maybe how it might be a false climate solution.
Thanks, Michael. We had a question submitted, and I'm seeing a theme of it here in another question about outcome-based conservation payment programs versus our current practice-based system. Could you speak to explain to me what would be an outcome-based program versus a practice-based program, and what some of the trade-offs and benefits might be?
Yeah, so again, one of the strengths and the drawbacks of our current conservation program is that it is completely voluntary, right? These are people who want to do conservation on their farm that are reaching out and they're signing up for or applying to programs like EQIP and CSP. And that's doing a lot of good work, but as I mentioned earlier, we're maybe talking 2% of US farmland being in EQIP, 2% in CSP. That's not a whole lot. So if you're looking at an outcomes-based conservation strategy, you might look at, for instance, the nitrate issue in southeast Minnesota and say, okay, we want to make sure that all drinking water in southeast Minnesota is at healthy levels of nitrates. How do we get there? Where are these nitrates coming from? And how can we stop that pollution from getting into drinking water? And then going from there, reaching out to farmers and landowners, looking at the kinds of solutions that you can do there. And you can do that at any level, at any kind of resource concern that you want. You want to reduce the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, you're going to need a multi-state approach, a national approach, really. And there have been some successes, I know, in the Chesapeake Bay area to do some of this more regional planning. And you've got some states that have moved, beyond the voluntary approach and have explored other options. So I think it's a big question, but I think looking at the, ways to clean up the pollution, to make our water cleaner, to make, whatever resource concern you're looking at, rather than just accepting whoever chooses to apply, right?
Yeah.
Because it's, again, I don't know how many of you all know Aaron Lehman from the Iowa Farmers Union, but he has a really good quote. When you drive through Iowa, you see random acts of conservation. patches here, patches there, but not a broader strategy of you know, ways to conserve all of our resources.
Mhm. Thanks, Michael. You touched on the issue that's happening right now with the closures of NRCS offices and the layoffs of staff. Could you just speak to more about, like, do we even have the capacity to run these programs with the current layoffs and the closures we're seeing?
Yeah, so I mean, we're based in Minnesota. Um, Recent estimates show that about a quarter of our NRCS staff here in Minnesota is no longer working at NRCS. And this was after years of boosting, boosting funding and boosting employment to try and help roll out the IRA, right? Like we were already understaffed to begin with. Then the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, and there was money set aside there to make sure we hired enough people to get those dollars out the door. And now, all of a sudden, a lot of those experts are gone. So one thing that we have seen when we've been understaffed at NRCS is, um, maybe a shift toward how can we get the contracts out the door with the resources we have. That might mean working on larger contracts and fewer of them, right? Will they go to a larger landowner and say, okay, we're going to just provide these resources to you. We can't fund everybody. For some of these programs, we're talking 100-page applications on the part of farmers, and a lot of that work ends up on the NRCS staff person, right? And there are efforts, maybe, things we should look at to modernize and streamline, but that actually requires more staff to do that, right? You can't just snap a finger and automate it, right? There is still a lot of people power that needs to be behind that, and this means fewer farm visits. This means fewer field days. This means, just really, really overworked and overstressed folks in the local offices. So anyway, this is the wrong time to be cutting staff. We need a lot more outreach to folks who have been shut out of these programs in the past.
And just briefly here in the last minute or so, could you talk about the impacts to the Conservation Technical Assistance Program too, and like where they fit in and what those cuts are going to do, or the proposed cuts?
Yeah, so as I mentioned in the recent president's budget request, he zeroed out the program. There's $0 advocated in their dream budget for conservation technical assistance, and that is the pot of money that pays our local conservationists to do their work. So, we're advocating for more funding for CTA, for conservation technical assistance. I don't think Congress is going to let $0 go out the door, but we may see a cut. And again, it's at the exact wrong time, right? We need as many boots on the ground as we can to get these dollars out the door and to get this conservation on the land. It's not just dollars. It's the landscape, right? It's farmers' livelihoods, and that's a big part of it.
We're gonna wrap things up in just a second here, but since we're on this thread here, Michael, some folks are wondering about how they can find how many USDA, FSA, and other local ag resources have been cut off in their state. Do you know of like these lists and like where people might find that data of what's being cut?
So as I mentioned earlier, we did write an article specifically focusing on NRCS offices, and that was about 48 offices across the U.S. We've got a really wonderful map that shows you, which communities those affected offices are in. I also recommend you can just go to the Department of Government Efficiency website. They have listed their lease terminations and proposed sell-offs of federal buildings. And you can, Control F or Command F, search your community or your state and see what they're proposing there.
Yeah.
And there are other resources out there. I just don't remember them at this moment.
Yeah, and that's okay. Thank you for answering that. Like Michael mentioned, there's an article from IATP that was just shared that might be a helpful resource for you to get at least a starting point of some of the closures we're seeing. So with that, we are going to conclude the webinar today. Thank you everyone for attending. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your questions. We have a handful that are left out there. If you are interested in some more follow-up, you can contact me directly and we'll try to connect you with those resources and get some more information to you. Please consider joining our next webinar coming up at the end of May in a couple weeks here, or May 22nd. This will be a further discussion on tariffs, trade, and the impact that we're seeing in agriculture. This is a broader discussion than the webinar we had earlier in April. This will be a panel with a handful of IATP staff, some board members. I think it'll be a really great conversation if you would like to get a further dive into those topics. In addition, we are finalizing our own details for an in-person event here in Minneapolis. It's looking like it'll be a sort of happy hour open house conversation with IATP staff and board. So mark your calendars for June 16th that evening. We will have some more information rolling out this week about the exact details, and we'll be very happy to have you there. So thanks once again for being here. Thank you, Michael, for sharing. We hope to see you at the next webinar, perhaps at our in-person event in June. And like I said, I will follow up with an email with some of the resources from the session today. The option is always there to email me directly, and let's set up a conversation and talk some more. Have a wonderful day. Keep doing the good work you're doing. Thank you.
Thanks all.